To be a journalist in Somalia is to take your life and put it in the hands of others. A half-dozen reporters have been killed there this year. And al-Shabab, the militant group that has imposed Sharia law in parts of the south, is not the only threat. There are no official regulations on what you can or cannot report in the three main regions, Somalia, Somaliland, and Puntland. However, journalists who criticize the government, al-Shabab, or certain clans and their leaders do so at their peril. Somehow, though, that hasn't seemed to stem the growth of the media sector or the flow of young journalists into the field. There are hundreds of radio, TV, and print outlets quenching the Somali thirst for news, and most operate in a hostile environment. The Listening Post's Phillips now on journalism in and about Somalia.
April 4th. An explosion rips through the first anniversary celebrations of Somalia's state satellite channel, Somali National TV. Several were killed and many more, mainly journalists, wounded. May 24th. A radio journalist is shot dead in Mogadishu. Ahmed Ado Anshur was the 7th journalist murdered from the same organization. It's been a deadly few years for the Shabelle media network.
No news network has been targeted as much as Shabelle. Several journalists have been killed there in recent years. Now, one of the reasons I think for this is because they are one of the few independent media organisations that exist in the country. Al-Shabab sees them as an enemy and they receive regular death threats from the Islamist group, but it's not just Al-Shabab. There are unconfirmed reports that recently, in an interview, the mayor of Mogadishu told Somali website that he was going to wipe out all of the journalists at Shabelle News Network.
Shabelle Media Network operate in the most volatile part of Somalia, Mogadishu and nearby towns and villages. Also, they do cover quite a lot of sensitive issues or topics. So the reasons why Shabelle Media Network lost more than any other Somali media organization could be because they are based in Mogadishu, or it could be because they cover sensitive stories. Nobody really knows.
If you're looking for answers, you could be looking a long time. Al-Shabab, one of the most notorious armed groups operating in Somalia, used to claim responsibility for murdered journalists. But over the last few years, the blame has been shifting, and Al-Shabab is by no means the only suspect.
The threat doesn't come from Al-Shabab only. The threat comes from all sorts of people, actors, all sorts of people who don't want these stories to come out. If you look at the last 5 victims, the last 5 journalists who got killed, I think none of them were killed by Al-Shabab. They were killed in Galkayo and other places in the government-controlled areas. So you can't blame only Al-Shabab.
When you go around Mogadishu, you realise that almost every single politician or big business owner believes that they could either have an influence or become President, Prime Minister, Speaker of the House. A lot of these politicians are backed by clans. Now, if you, as a journalist, go against that particular clan, you can expect that your life expectancy will be cut short substantially.
Look at the number of radio stations or the number of TV channels that have been closed or been raided in the last year or so. Most of them, if not all, are not in Al-Shabaab controlled areas. So putting the blame solely on Al-Shabaab, I think that's oversimplification of the situation in Somalia.
An oversimplification. But Al-Shabab has a history with Somali media. Its recent ransacking of Radio Markable, an independent station in the southwest, was typical of its persistent attempts to block both state and independent radio transmissions. It's the organization's way of countering the media message, transmitted by hundreds of Somali outlets, no matter where they're based. This is Universal TV's headquarters, based not in Mogadishu, not in Hargeisa, not in Puntland, but in London. Since 2005, it has been transmitting daily news bulletins to Somalia's 3 main regions, and Somalis all over the world. And now this channel finds itself competing with other offshore news organizations, all of which are out to satisfy the thirst for news in and on Somalia.
The media landscape in Somalia has been growing since 1991, and obviously every single Somali person in the diaspora or inside Somalia wants to have some sort of information, whether it's news or programs about the political crisis in Somalia or about the life of Somalis in Somalia.
Somali people in general, they are actually very news oriented. They gather news all the time. Either it became a private or government or whatever, assault or whatever. They are more interested about what's going on. That's when they even shaking your hands, they tell you, do you have any news?
And these days, the series of attacks on Somali media is the news. But in a country plagued with corruption, to say that journalists are always victims would be simply inaccurate.
Corruption is rife. I always say to Somali journalists, we were meant to fight corruption. As journalists, we were meant to expose the bad guys. But if we are the bad guys, then how could you say, I am doing a good thing?
I was in a press conference, and as soon as the press conference finished, there was somewhat of a gathering towards one side. And I looked, and there was money being exchanged. And I was told that is how it works. You want your story to be covered, you have to pay the journalist. You cannot defend that kind of behavior, but then when you know the journalists paid less than $50 a month, and they do have a family and people who depend on them. So it is a market industry.
The main issues in Somalia is the ownership of media houses. Most are bought or either controlled by private businesses, so there's a lack of independence there. And most of these people who own these media outlets belong to one clan or the other, so there is a clan-based agenda when it comes to journalism.
But corruption is just one of Somalia's worries right now. It's a country that's been torn apart by years of civil war, famine, drought and piracy. And it's lucky hundreds of young Somalis are still queuing up to tell its story.
It's a tough job, and somebody has to do it. And somebody has to really convey the message. The other people are actually very keen to know. You have to either kill something or to be killed.
A person who summed it up for me was a journalist who worked at Shabelle Radio. His name was Hassan Fantastic, and he told me that he understood the threats, he understood the dangers of working as a journalist, but he felt that he had to do it. He had to get the truth out.
And doing this job can come at a high price. On January 30th, Hassan Fantastic was shot dead outside his house. There is a real risk for young Somali journalists, but for the time being, it's still one many are willing to take.
More Global Village Voices now on the state of and dangers of journalism in Somalia.
The number of journalists and media outlets in Somalia is increasing on a daily basis, and the quality is also improving, given that there is a boom in technology and many of them are able to reach out to the worldwide network and tell the stories that no one else can tell. However, this brings unsafe consequences. Some journalists have already got killed in areas controlled by the government. Just gives us that extra insight that there's not always one group behind the killings.
Anyone who follows Somali news closely knows that you cannot blame one particular group for the routine attacks on Somali journalists. Unfortunately, they've been suffering for a very long time and in all the different parts of the country, regardless of who is in charge.